Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and welcome to June of 1849, installment 2 of Dickens's David Copperfield. A few things that I will be going over today are the ideas of the cliffhanger in serialized publication, a way of reading the chapter titles. We'll go over some onomastics, which you'll remember from last week is the study of names. There will be a passage of close reading. I'll briefly discuss some ideas of empire and racism. I'll look at one illustration, and I will end by beginning to consider the very complicated idea of Victorian money. In this installment, in the 3 chapters, we have the confrontation of Copperfield and Mr. Murdstone out in Blunderstone and the ideas of education. In chapter 5, David makes his way to Salem House. And in chapter 6, we have the introduction to the other students. Let's start by thinking about cliffhangers. So chapter 3, installment 1, back in May of 1849, ended with this sentence. As soon as I could creep away, I crept upstairs. My old dear bedroom was changed, and I was to lie a long way off. I rambled downstairs to find anything that was like itself. So altered it all seemed, and roamed into the yard. I very soon started back from there, for the empty dog kennel was filled up with a great dog, deep-mouthed and black-haired, like him. And he was very angry at the sight of me, and sprang out to get at me. So where we end is this idea that the dog is in mid-leap. Immediately, we are stuck with wondering what will happen. And we have to spend a month wondering this, talking to our friends, our colleagues, our family, strangers. What's going on with this dog? We pick up at the next installment, chapter 4. If the room to which my bed was removed were a sentient thing that could give evidence, I might appeal to it at this day. Who sleeps there now, I wonder? To bear witness for me, what a heavy heart I carried to it. I went up there, hearing the dog in the yard bark after me all the while I climbed the stairs, and looking as blank and strange upon the room as the room looked upon me, sat down with my small hands crossed and thought. So as you can see, we don't actually pick up with this dog, the dog attack, but Dickens actually gave us a clue in the end of the first installment. You'll have noticed with the punctuation, or the kind of typography that we have, that the H on him was capitalized. And we learned he was very angry at me and sprang out to get at me. The antecedent, of course, is the dog. The capital H, though, is Murdstone. And there's ambiguity here with this E. And this, in fact, will be what ends up happening in installment 2, chapter 4. Mr. Murdstone will be the person who is angry at the sight of David Copperfield and who is the one that will beat Copperfield. However, we also pick up other imagery of dogs throughout installment 2. So here we can see this following sentence when Mr. Murdstone is talking to David, offering a threat. David, he said, making his lips thin by pressing them together, if I have an obstinate horse or dog to deal with, what do you think I do? And he'll respond that he beats him. We also learn from later in the education, quote unquote, from Murdstone, the natural result of this treatment continued, I suppose, for some 6 months or more, was to make me sullen, dull, and dogged. I was not made the less so by my sense of being daily more and more shut out and alienated from my mother. I believe I should have been almost stupefied, but for one circumstance. So there's that term, dogged. Copperfield beginning to feel like a dog. After all, he is the one being beaten. And the idea kind of arises, if this behavior continues, will Copperfield be the kind of person that responds truculently, or will he maintain his innocence? Later on, once Copperfield has made his way to London, he sees a sign, and there's a placard on it. I got upon the desk immediately, apprehensive of at least a great dog underneath. But though I looked all round with anxious eyes, I could see nothing of him. I was still engaged in peering about when Mr. Mell came back and asked me what I did up there. I beg your pardon, sir, says I. If you please, I'm looking for the dog. Dog? He says, what dog? Isn't it a dog, sir? Isn't what a dog? That's to be taken care of, sir, that bites. No, Copperfield, says he gravely. That's not a dog. That's a boy. So here, after all, Copperfield had bitten Mr. Murdstone on the hand, and now we have this translated effect whereby Copperfield has become a dog. He's being animalized, dehumanized by wearing this sign. We also get the introduction of the boys in chapter 6, and this is Tommy Traddles kind of beginning the joking around this idea. The greater part of the boys could not resist the temptation of pretending that I was a dog, and patting and soothing me lest I should bite, and saying, lie down, sir, and calling me Towser. This was naturally confusing among so many strangers and cost me some tears. But on the whole, it was much better than I had anticipated. So here we can kind of see how Dickens lays down the cliffhanger that there will be a dog attack at the end of installment 1. And then we don't actually get that dog, but we have the development of doggish mentions and imagery that carry forth. Part of Dickens's subtlety and his craft is to amp up the expectation and the tension and then diffuse it through his literary techniques. I want to now turn to talk about the 3 chapter titles. And this kind of exercise is one that you can do with any chapter title. And chapter titles are what is called paratext, which means anything that's next to para, the text, paratext. And what it lets us do is kind of create different arguments or different interpretations that actually lie slightly outside of the main body of the text, but still give us insight into them. So if we consider chapter 4, I fall into disgrace. Here, it is an active sentence, but the verb to fall doesn't imply a lot of agency. And in fact, many times throughout this chapter, David will fall when he is beaten, when his memory fails, along those lines. Chapter 5 is very interesting in terms of voice. I am sent away from home. Notice that passive voice. I am sent away from home. It's not I go away from home, or I travel afar, or I head into London, or I go to school. It is I am sent away from home. David Copperfield does not have agency in his own life at this point. We gain a little bit of agency starting in chapter 6. I enlarge my circle of acquaintance. It's also kind of nice. This sentence gets longer, or this chapter title gets longer, and David is the person kind of getting more acquaintances, his friends that we meet. We also get more names placed at that point. So this is just a little hint as to some of the richness that lies inside of the sentences, of the chapter titles. And I would encourage you, as you encounter a new title, to treat it almost like a commercial for what's to come, in a similar manner that you can to the 2 illustrations that would have been present at the start of the serial numbers. Quickly, in terms of onomastics, which again is the study of names, and the idea that especially Dickensian names often have different plays. And in this case, the Salem House faculty all have musical associations. So the head of the school, Mr. Creakle, right, in his name, we have this creak sound. It imitates his voice, which is always at a whisper, but it also implies an unpleasant tonal noise. Tungay, you'll remember, he's the one that has the wooden leg. We can actually maybe make out a gay tune in his name, but this is meant to be ironic because The sound of his wooden leg striking the ground is often very threatening. It's not a happy sound. It's strident. And he's also always repeating things that Creakle says. The other school teacher, Mr. Sharp, the idea of sharp and flat, right? Common musical tones. And then Mr. Mel, missing an L here, is the first part of melody. And you know, in many ways, Mr. Mel falls short of reaching melody, whether it is trying to play the flute or just not standing up for himself or his charges. Let's look at a short piece of close reading here from chapter 4. And the exercise here is what is left unsaid. So last week we looked pretty closely at the way in which punctuation can divide a sentence. And in this moment, what I would like to point to is the different ways that Dickens can imply something, and we have to read closer. So these are both moments when David's memory has failed. As he took me out at the door, my mother ran towards us. Miss Murdstone said, "Clara, are you a perfect fool?" and interfered. I saw my mother stop her ears then, and I heard her crying. And the next, a few lines later, David gets out to be aired every day during his confinement. And he says, "I only observed that my mother was as far off from me as she could be, and kept her face another way so that I never saw it, and that Mr. Murdstone's hand was bound up in a large linen wrapper." So there's a couple of things that are worth noting here. The first one is Miss Murdstone's very odd interjection saying, "Clara, are you a perfect fool?" This is not the kind of behavior we come to expect from Miss Murdstone, who is always supporting her brother. However, it creates a tension and a very small moment of much needed female solidarity. Miss Murdstone knows her brother's violent tendencies, and she's saying, without saying, "Clara, are you a perfect fool? If you interfere, you will be beaten." We then find out what has happened with the next sentence. My mother was as far off from me as she could be, and kept her face another way so that I never saw it. Mr. Murdstone has beaten Clara. Dickens will not come out and say this as an instance of domestic abuse, but when you put the pieces together, you can read inside of that. And we have the reason why, right? Mr. Murdstone's hand is still bound. So the idea seems to be, as long as Murdstone still has evidence of David having bitten his hand, the whole household will be punished. So now I want to turn to a couple implied ideas of empire and some racism that we have there as well. This comes in the introduction to Mr. Creakle. "I'll tell you what I am," whispered Mr. Creakle, letting it go at last with a screw at parting that brought my water into my eyes. "I'm a Tartar." "A Tartar," said the man with the wooden leg. "When I say I'll do a thing, I'll do it," said Mr. Creakle. "And when I say I will have a thing done, I will have it done." "We'll have a thing done. I will have it done," repeated the man with the wooden leg. So there's a few different things that are happening here with this particular use of the word Tartar. So Tartar or Tartary is a region in Central Asia. It ends up getting used, though, to mean a number of different regions that kind of spread from Turkey to the east. And so later on in the 1950s, during the Crimean War, there'll be an increased reference to the Tartars. At this point, A Tartar is a ruling class in China, and they were involved in this first Opium War. But another thing that it means, or where it's used, is this battleship here that you see, the HMS Tartar, which is present in the image. This was a ship that went and patrolled around Jamaica. So what we have implied, I think, is this idea of David as helpless, Creakle as kind of the gunship controlling David's presence. His island is the school. He is a subject in many different ways to the forceful control of Creakle. There might also be some punning happening on the repetition here and Tungay having a wooden leg, a little bit of piratical language that's present. Fascinatingly, Dickens will actually come back to the language of a Tartar when he writes Edwin Drood, and you get Mr. Tartar, the lieutenant, who has come back to London after a successful military career. So that kind of solidifies this connection between British imperialism and the name Tartar. I don't want to reject any sense that there's also the possible puns on plaque, tartar on your teeth, but I don't personally have anything to add to that. A couple of more sections. So this is going to involve a couple of linguistic patterns here. So in chapter 6, we learn more about Tungay. I heard that the man with the wooden leg, whose name was Tungay, was an obstinate barbarian who had formerly assisted in the hop business and had come into the scholastic line with Mr. Creakle, in consequence, as was supposed among the boys, of his having broken his leg in Mr. Creakle's service and having done a deal of dishonest work for him and knowing his secrets. So here we have this particular use of barbarian, which is a word that gets used, especially in kind of language of Western and white supremacy, to talk about the other and to distance one's civilized self from another person. So here we have David and the boys being set up to be educated future gentlemen and middle class versus Tungay, who is something of a mobster, it kind of seems to be here, right? Uneducated working class, having his wooden leg. Also the fact that he only repeats what other people say. The origins of the term barbarian are actually Greek, and barbaros, which is where we get barbarian from, was a Greek word meaning people who go bar, meaning they do not speak Greek. And so in this case, we have a possible further distancing from Tungay on account of education. Another rather more explicit racist moment comes with the rest of the passage we already saw about Dickens turning Copperfield into the dog. And so this is later in chapter 6. It was a happy circumstance for me that Traddles came back first. He enjoyed my placard so much that he saved me from the embarrassment of either disclosure or concealment by presenting me to every other boy who came back, great or small, immediately on his arrival in this form of introduction. Look here, here's a game happily too. The greater part of the boys came back low-spirited and were not so boisterous at my expense as I had expected. Some of them certainly did dance about me like wild Indians, and the greater part could not resist the temptation of pretending that I was a dog and patting and soothing me lest I should bite, and saying, "Lie down, sir," and calling me Towser. So here we have this moment with the simile of comparing the boys dancing about him like wild Indians. This is the racist caricature of Native Americans, indigenous populations of the United States that was presented in England in a number of different ways. So you had illustrations, but then you also had impresarios bringing over people from the United States and presenting them and charging money to see them sit around. So there's a lot of really racist reimaginings about the indigenous experience in America happening in 19th century Britain. Let's jump ahead to an illustration now. And this is the illustration from chapter 5 with the friendly waiter. So what I want to do is unpack a few of the ways in which this illustration comments on the events of the novel so far and other things that we've kind of been commenting on already. So plot-wise, textually, what this covers is David, who's in the text. Notice his feet still don't touch the ground on the chair. It's going to be always important. And this confident waiter leaning and holding his mug of beer that he's cheated David out of. This moment is a quotation or an update of the Fox and the Raven, a story about tricking the grapes out of the bird, getting them to drop, right? So we have an Aesop fable being reflected. Above that, we have this fish, implying a couple of things. David is a small fish in the big pond now that he's in London. He's also been caught by the tricks of the waiter because he's helpless. So David is prey to the predator of the waiter. There's a literary comment happening in this illustration, in this picture. This is Sancho Panza from the Adventures of Don Quixote. And of rather more interest to me are the maps on the background. So here on the right-hand side of the illustration, you see a map of Yorkshire, a little bit northern England, very provincial, a small area, versus, and in contrast to, the world map on the other side. And I won't go into great detail right now, but I would encourage you to observe Australia there on the map. So the sense seems to be this movement from the localized to the global, a similar movement that David, now that he's leaving Blunderstone and Yarmouth to go to London, is also starting to experience, and the cost of that and the things that it takes to make those changes. We also, so that's one pair of doubling with these two maps. We also have on the side two different placards. These are ones I have blown up and placed separately on the image. So this image, this placard advertises an auction. We have the name Robinson, and we hear will sell and freehold. So this idea of things are up for sale in a new way than David has ever experienced before. The choice of the name Robinson seems particularly interesting because David is constantly comparing himself to Robinson Crusoe during his maladventures with education under Murdstone's guidance, pedagogy. And Robinson Crusoe obviously doesn't do anything economic on the island, really. And so we have that change, that switch. The way that Robinson's name is in between the auctioning and the selling and holding also gives this idea of being trapped inside of something. On the other side is a playbill, which you can see here and kind of make out, advertising two different plays. Two Gentlemen of Verona, an early Shakespeare play involving kind of friendship in disguise, and a play called The Devil to Pay. This idea of owing something greater on a cosmic level, the costs of experience, I might also say to that. So lastly, I will add, we have this mirror where nothing is reflected in it. Always interesting to think about mirrors and mirroring. Of course, as I pointed out, the entire image is itself mirrored straight down the middle. So it folds over on itself. Notice a pretty playful moment here where the way that the different business cards have been stuck into the mirror kind of creates a face that looks like it's yelling. That might just be what I'm seeing, a form of pareidolia, which is seeing faces inside of things. But it's a technique that Fizz really does appreciate. And then notice his name there at the bottom, Fizz signing his work. Oops. All right, so kind of to bring things to a close, I want to briefly talk about money. This is something that I will say I do not know a lot about. So I think about what I was going to say is almost right. There are people that know much more about this than I do. But I just want to give us a little bit of a sense of some of the jokes that are completely lost on us because they're based on 19th century British economics, which was a pre-decimalized money system. So I'm basing this off of this quotation from chapter 6, where Steerforth says, "What money have you got, Copperfield?" he said, walking aside with me when he had disposed of my affair in these terms. I told him 7 shillings. So throughout these chapters, 5 and 6, Copperfield spends money, but Copperfield has no idea what money is worth, either in terms of the economic or value, any of these different ways. And we watch Steerforth kind of buy things with the money. So as a very rough comparison, I have here 2 different pages taken from the Victorian web. The addresses are on the screen. If you also search Victorian money, Victorian web, these will come up, and a number of other resources. So in the 1960s, it says that common laborers earned 3 shillings 9 pence per week. So that means that they have spent almost the equivalent of 2 weeks labor on this feast. An excavator wearing long water boots, 4 shillings 6 pence. Bricklayers, carpenters, masons, and smiths, 6 shillings 6 pence. An engineer, 7 and 6. So we might also see what a couple of things cost. This is in 1888, so half a century after our novel, pretty much. So we can expect a fair amount of inflation in between those periods. But meat costs 4 shillings, bread for 10 loaves, that's quite a bit of bread, 2 and 3 and 5 pence. Tea, 1. So just a little bit of some numbers to start thinking about these things. If you're interested in it, I would highly encourage you to pursue looking into this on your own and let me know what's going on with it. Finally, in conclusion, I want to consider a small possibility of a biblical allusion in this feast that we have. As to me, I sat on his left hand and the rest were grouped about us, on the nearest beds and on the floor. So this is a formal feast that's happening. Of course, it's these children, and so it's kind of a pastiche of a formal feast. And I think that there might be an idea of, instead of a Last Supper, kind of a First Supper. Steerforth is the one in the middle handing out the food. And instead of being seated at the right hand, right on the good luck side, David is seated on the left hand. So something to keep in mind with this idea of closeness, but also maybe a little bit of discomfort. And something else to just let float around in the back of your mind is a sense of Steerforth as some kind of salvation figure. Thank you very much. And next week, we are on to installment 3.